Well, good morning, good afternoon, and I understand it should be appropriate to say good evening to some folks that are on the line here today. I understand that there are individuals from far and distant lands that are participating in the webinar, so welcome to everybody. This is Dave Call. I'm a managing partner here at Value Selling Associates, and it's my pleasure to deliver today's webinar entitled Exceptional Qualification, Improving the Quantity and Quality of Your Pipeline. Quick background on myself. Again, you can see my name there is Dave Call. I've been with the Value Selling organization working with the methodology. Actually, I'll present it in two ways. I've been working directly with the organization for the past 17 years. I spend my time about half and half in terms of selling and marketing the value selling services, and about the other half of my time delivering the training and the consulting services that we provide. And I mention that in large part because the content that we're going to be talking about today really represents a number of the best practices that myself and my colleagues have seen over our many years here about how best-in-class organizations do exactly as that title suggests, about how we do an exceptional job of, I'm going to break it down into three component parts, about how we do an exceptional job of generating new opportunities for us to pursue, how we do an exceptional job of moving those opportunities through the sales process, and how best-in-class organizations, of course, do an exceptional job of closing that business and getting the most out of the pipeline that we can. So I want to let you know that today's webinar is scheduled to last about 45 minutes worth of content is what I estimate that I'll be discussing. We'll follow that on with some question and answer time. And I'll let you know that the whole thing should be wrapped up in approximately 1 hour or less. I want to make sure you have plenty of time to get back to your daily activities. And then I want to let you know that the session is being recorded so that if you have colleagues or others who wish to listen into it, the recording will be available. The slides and the recording will be available approximately 48 hours after today's webinar. So without further ado, let me jump into it. There are four particular objectives that I want to get into today. Number one, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about how we can do an exceptional job of identifying high potential opportunities. Where do we best look for those opportunities to pursue? And we're going to leverage some of the concepts, and I'll share with you some of the information from a new offering that we released in 2017 called Vortex Prospecting. And I'll share with you some of the highlights from that and some of the best practices that we see organizations adopting and implementing. We'll also be talking about forecasting themselves. Why, unfortunately, a number of those, why they can be inaccurate, why deals stall, why opportunities stall, especially at the latter stages. We'll talk about, and I'll introduce you what we call the qualified prospect formula. It's a very straightforward, easy to use, if you will, approach for how we can do a best job of determining how well qualified an opportunity is. And I'll use the expression how we can identify gaps in our understanding, where we may be missing particular key pieces of information to determine how well qualified the opportunity is. Because it's not just about checking the boxes. It's really about making sure that we've got a good match between our capabilities and their needs. And lastly, we'll talk about the keys to exceptionally high close rates. We'll talk about that formula, as I just mentioned there, the qualified prospect formula, and just the ways that we can continually qualify those opportunities to ensure the greatest probability that we'll be able to generate business out of that. So again, let me proceed. And actually, before I jump into the content, I'd like to take just a moment and go with you a quick warm-up exercise. And I like to do this, whether it's being on these types of webinars or through the workshops that I run, just to get our mental muscle ready and engaged and to go through that warm-up activity. So what I'm going to show you is this. This is a diagram. You can hopefully all see that on the screen right now. And we call it the brain diamond mirror. And the issue or challenge, if you will, to try to do is I want you to look at it and see how many different ways that you can read the word brain, B-R-A-I-N, from letters that are next to each other, or I'll say adjacent to each other. So I'm going to just be quiet here for just a moment and let you look at it. and see if you can think about how many different ways can you read the word brain. I'll give you another, say, 5 seconds to look at it. Okay, you think you've got that number in your mind? Well, let me tell you what the answer is. The answer is actually 60. And you can see from the way it's laid out here that each B touches 4 R's, then R touches 1 A that touches 7 INs, and you multiply it through, and you can see there's 60 different ways. Wow, that's quite a number out of that brain diamond mirror. Now, let me show you again the diagram, and as you look at it, I can share with you again how I saw this. And when I first saw this diagram, this brain teaser, mind test here, I tell you, I saw 4, and I saw it this way first. Most of us read in English that we read from left to right. So we start with the 1B in the middle, and we go which way? We go from left to right. So we see that brain, and then we say, wait a minute, it's a challenge, so I got to look for other ways. And it was very likely that we saw either going backwards, going from right to left, or maybe going up or going down. But as you know, it's a challenge, so we started thinking about it. But my point was that I know that my very first time I looked at it, that's where I initially stopped. I didn't really think beyond that because I thought I had all the different possibilities solved. But if you think about it again, we start seeing the different ways. We take that stem there and we branch up and down and all the different derivations of it. And so as it said a moment ago, there are in fact 60 different ways that we can write the word brain from the letters that are next to or adjacent to each other. And so you may be thinking like, well, why is this guy starting off a webinar in this way? Well, it is to, in fact, warm up. But it's also to help us, the point of today's webinar would be to help us think about different ways, maybe exceptional ways or best practices for how we can achieve optimal results. So a little bit of fun here to get going, and let's move on. You know, as I mentioned, that there's going to be 3 main parts to our program. And that's to drive exceptional results. It's really pretty straightforward, isn't it? We've got to, number 1, well, actually I should say selling, when we think about it, is actually pretty straightforward. We've got to do, number 1, we've got to create some new opportunities. Number 2, we've got to move them through the sales process. And thirdly, we've got to close those opportunities. So for our friends or family that we speak to, they think, oh, sales is easy. Find opportunities, you move them through the process, and they close on them, you get them to buy. Well, we all know in reality that that's not so easy. And each part of this particular funnel has different challenges that are associated with it. Creating new opportunities, yeah, it sounds easy, but we all know it's not. Now, some of us may have marketing organizations that have very good marketing generated leads that they provide to our sales, ourselves in sales and our sales counterparts. But still, in most organizations, what we see is that the responsibility for generating opportunities is still largely responsible for the sales organizations themselves and the sales individuals themselves. So we're going to make sure that we talk about ways that we see that may be done optimally, best practice, if you will, within that. Moving it through the sales process, we're going to again look at best ways to do that. And I'll preview it by saying that we're going to look at how we can map the sales process and look at it from a customer's perspective or a client's perspective and look at how they buy and map the sales process to the buying process. And lastly, we'll talk about closing, and in conjunction with that, how closing is very difficult when it's done at the very end of the process, but we've done an excellent job throughout. The closing is a very natural outcome, especially it can be facilitated best when we've qualified it throughout that sales process. So let's take the next step and look at the top of that funnel and look at how we can best create these new opportunities. And as I mentioned, we're going to leverage and share with you some of the concepts from our relatively new program, Vortex Prospecting. Now, I'll start off with a little bit of fun. We've got a picture here. You can see it's a very happy looking fellow. probably an aging baby boomer there is my guess from that particular picture. And I'll just read you some of the lines. It says here, I don't know who you are. I don't know your company's product, or your company stands for, your reputation, your record, your customers. Now, what is it you want to sell me? And it's just a fun way of representing that. Some of us may come from organizations that have great brands. When we think about organizations that are household names. Well, for others, for many of us out there, and I'm going to bet that's the majority of the folks listening on the line, our companies may not yet be household brands. They're not the IBMs or the Kodaks or the Facebooks or the Googles of the world. There are other companies that have thousands and thousands of them that are out there in the marketplace. And so the number one challenge is really getting the attention of our prospective customers. And we're going to go through talk more about getting more detail of that. And I just take a moment, though, and mention that getting the attention of a prospective customer is equally as challenging at what we're finding across the various age spans in the marketplace. Still today, many of the individuals that we're going to be calling on, especially if they're in more senior leadership roles, might be like this picture of this individual, if you will, the aging baby boomer. But it's also Gen X's are now taking on increasing responsibilities in leadership and management roles in organizations, as are millennials. And in fact, the research that we've seen here seems to indicate that getting in front of, or getting access to, or getting awareness of millennials may even be more difficult than it may be for some of the other generational categories. And that's because millennials often look at their peer group and use the social media, and when an opportunity or a new prospective organization that they want to investigate or is reaching out to them, they're going to use that social media network to try to vet it out. If that network hasn't heard of you and your company and your capabilities, you know what? It may even be, I'm going to contend that's even more challenging to gain entree into a millennial that's, in that case there, than it would be some of the other generations who may be more open to some of the other mediums, like email and phone and so forth. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Now, I'm going to present a couple of the key concepts that come from the Vortex prospecting approach. And the number one piece I'll start with, the key concept number one here, is I want to take a moment and really just actually start with, and actually relate back to a phrase, and you may have heard the name Peter Drucker. He was a great management thinker in history, and he had this expression that many of you may have heard about. It says, he once said, if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And I really like that because, again, when we think about the getting opportunities in the top part of our funnel, we need to begin by understanding what that funnel, how much activity that we need to have and to generate in order to be successful. And so with that, I'm going to point out some of the points on this chart here, and I'm going to say that we need to understand, our prospecting ratios. So in the example, let me walk you through it. If we have, say, an annual target, an annual quota of $2 million, and based on the historical records of your organization, your average transaction size is $125,000, we do the math. That would require 16 transactions. 2 million divided by 125 equals 16 transactions to achieve our target number. Well, go another step further. If we know that our average win ratio is about 1 out of 3, and by the way, I'll mention that is the historical ratios that we've read about, that we've seen about, that we observe in our business as well, from our clients, that is, that about 1 out of every 3 opportunities results in a win. Now, let's take the next step further. In order to get those qualified prospects, we got to have a number of meetings. So let's say we've got to have we've got to do the math there. We have 1 out of every 3 to get the wins there. 3 times the 16 equals 48. And so our pipeline ratio, meaning how many different conversations that we need to have in order to generate those qualified opportunities, maybe 1 out of 5. 5 meetings that take place with different individuals will result in one opportunity moving its way through the sales process. So once again, let's do the math. 5 times 48 equals 240 per year, about 20 per month, or roughly about 1 a day. So I'll pause there for a second and kind of let that sink in. And I do so, I meant in the workshops that we run, I often get the expression as individuals run through this here and they see that math and they think, oh my gosh, 1 new opportunity a day, 20 a month, 240 a year in order to achieve this. And sometimes I feel like I see the reaction. It reminds me of the character that Macaulay Culkin played in the movie Home Alone, with his mouth wide open, his hands across, on each side of his face, and that Well, don't panic. That may be true for your business. And the actual activity I let you think about as an outcome of this is do the math on your own. Take your individual organization, take your annual number that you need to generate, what the average transaction size that you've experienced or that your company has, what's been the win ratio that you've had. Historically, it suggests that about 1 out of 3. Maybe your organization has done a better job and your results have been 1 out of every 2 or 60% win rate, what have you. That would be great. And you may, in fact, have had less number of meetings in order to generate that prospect, qualified prospect. So maybe just 1 out of every 3 can do it. Point being is this. We need to know what that number is, because we need to know how much activity is going to be required in order to generate the opportunities for us to pursue. So that's key concept number 1. Let's move on and talk about key concept number 2. And key concept number 2 is mentioned that when we think about business development, we think about prospecting. Well, first and foremost, prospecting is usually not something that everyone wants to raise their hand and say, oh, I love it. I love to do it. But we find that the most successful organizations, that best practice especially of individuals themselves, is that prospecting is in fact an ongoing activity. It's not stop and start. It's something that we do on an ongoing basis in order to just continually replenish that pipeline. Now, I fully acknowledge that there are ebbs and flows in our activities and our work cycles. There's periods of time where we're going to be more focused on closing business, for example, or following through on implementations that may be parts of our job. And that's okay. I mean, those ebbs and flows will take place. But the best practice that we see out there, best performers achieve optimal results, actually create an ongoing cadence. I like that word, the cadence of their prospecting activities. So it's just something that they continually are doing. And the way that they do that is they actually create time on their calendars for that marketing, the business development, that prospecting activities. And they calendar it. And I would like you to think about doing so and actually look at those meetings on your calendar and think about that block of time that you set aside, whether it be an hour or 2 hours in a given day, and treat it just as you would a meeting with a actual face-to-face meeting with a prospective customer or a prospect, if you will. That's something that's going to be very precious. It's something if you're having a meeting with a prospect, you're very likely to want to shift that or postpone it. And I'd ask you to apply that same discipline to the time you reserve on your calendar for your prospecting activities. Now, there's a tool that we've got available on the Value Selling website there. We call it a Master Time Allocation Calendar. And it helps us to think about, you're welcome to later time, go down and download and retrieve it there, and help us prioritize those things that we need to do in our activities. Help us think about what's the most important thing, how much time that we should be allocating to that, as well as start the process of calendaring the time that we need for prospecting. You know, it's a little side story here is that when I was getting ready for today's webinar, I began that process a couple weeks ago. Again, thinking about the topic and thinking about the key points I wanted to cover in today's webinar. And I realized as I was beginning to do it, I'd like many of us, I've been very busy. I've been traveling for business. Separately, I went to a conference and was participating in that. And I realized here was the early part of the month of April, and I hadn't done what I preach, which is that I hadn't made the time to actually block the times for business development and prospecting activities. So it made me go back and look at my calendar and say, geez, when am I going to build in my cadence for my activities? When are my times that I'm going to be setting aside specifically for reaching out, making those calls, generating those emails, following up, and so forth? So I keep concept number 2, as I mentioned here, is make sure that we think about business development prospecting not as a one-time activity or something that we only do when we absolutely have to, but think about it as an ongoing activity. And it's interesting, one other point I'll mention about it, when we do this, we create that regular cadence, I find that it's much less uncomfortable and much more familiar, much more welcoming, and therefore much more successful. Let's move on to concept number 3. And when we think about our, our, our prospecting and business development activities, we have to keep in the forefront of our minds that when we reach out to somebody, it's an interruption. Whether we like it or not, our email that comes into them, our phone call that comes into them, is something that they probably are not expecting. It's probably something that's only going to disrupt them from whatever activities that they've got planned on their calendars. And with that in mind, we have to make sure that they are the focus of those communications. And that with that, we have to think about the value add that we want to try to communicate. Now, I mention it because if you want to, it's a very subtle but critical difference in how we say or say both in writing and verbally the things we're trying to communicate. Think about the subtle difference between saying, I'd like to speak with you about my services versus I'd like to share with you information about how other organizations are dealing with similar issues. Very, again, slight difference, but when the focus is on them, I believe it has greater opportunity for them to see some potential value and want to respond, again, be in writing or answer the phone and actually want to engage with us. And so I've got a couple of phrases there that you can see that ways that I think that we can help communicate that we're going to be sharing value or providing value in those conversations. Things like industry research shows, or what we're seeing is that, or our clients tell us that, ways that, again, we're imparting that we have information or insights or knowledge that will be of value to them if they were to engage us. In particular, I like that middle one, what we're seeing, because what that indicates is actually 2 very important points. Number 1 that I mentioned is that we have insights or information or knowledge that we'll impart, which is out of value. And the second point of this is that it's coming from us. It's from us as individuals. So that we recognize us as knowledge experts, and that, again, that much more impetus for them to want to interact with us because, again, we as individuals have something that we can add to them. Now, I'll mention the one thing. This approach, again, focusing on them and providing those insights does presume that we have done our homework, that we have gathered information that would be a benefit for them. This can be done either through our own individual research. It can be done from experiences that we've had from our own existing customers or interaction with other customers throughout the organization, or it might be able to come from, depending upon your organization, if we have it, information and intelligence that our marketing organization or other parts of the business provide. But again, the key point I'm mentioning is that we need to make sure that it's focused on them because they're not expecting that interaction or that interruption, and they got to be able to receive something from it if we're going to be coming in and interrupting their day. I want to talk about key concept number 4. And this I think is probably, if not the most important, certainly one of the top ones. And it's about sharing previous successes. Now, if we're going to be looking to get that attention, and what I like to say that we want to be able to leverage the successes that we've had with some of our other customers, whether ours personally or through the broader organization, and share specific results, if we can, about how we've helped them. So you can see my example on the screen, how we've helped a company that's similar to theirs reduce their inventory by 20%, which freed up, very specifically, $500,000 in capital. The more specific we can be, the better. Now, this does, again, if we have, and by the way, when I talk about specifics, if we have companies that have been willing to share with us or willing to allow us to use their name and the metrics they achieved, that's the holy grail. So if you can say that company, our client XYZ achieved this specific result, that's better than saying a Midwest manufacturer. The more specific, the better, but we need to make sure, again, to caution that we have to have permission from those organizations to be able to use that. So the other thing I'd say is that the more stories that we can have, the better. And this has multiple benefits. The broader, more experience I have, the more stories, it adds to the overall credibility that we can communicate. But there's also a very simultaneous, subtle, and critically important confidence that we build. You know, when we see and we read about and we hear about the success that our organization drives, very subtly in the back of our brains that we building that confidence about, yeah, we really do provide value to our customers. And it's really something that when we have that excitement in our minds, that gets communicated in ever so subtle ways in how we talk. So if we actually have somebody on the phone and how we communicate and they can hear that excitement in our voices. It's also in in the tone that we use when we leave an email or, a voicemail. And I tell you, I believe it's communicated very subtly in the emails that we write. People sense that excitement and that successes that we have. So reiterating, let's make sure that we gather those. And it can be through our own individual experiences, the experience of our colleagues, or asking other parts of our organizations, like our marketing organization, to help us develop those success stories. Let's make sure they're specific, if at all possible, and make sure they're relevant. I have one other aspect I want to talk about other and high potential opportunities. And that's when now that we've armed ourselves with the tools like the success stories and blocking out our time, we're really ready to begin our prospecting efforts. But where do we start? And so I want to think about leveraging our prior successes and doing it in a couple of specific ways. Number one, let's look for organizations in the same or similar industries. And this makes me think about when I first sales opportunities, I was working with a relatively small organization, and we found a very successful application for the software that we're providing in the financial services marketplace. It became extremely successful in one of our very first implementations. So what did we do? Well, the first thing we do was start running out and contacting other financial institutions to talk about how our application would be beneficial and helping them save literally tens of thousands of hours in what had been a manual process that could now be automated. So clearly, one of the first places we go, as I mentioned here, is trying to same or similar industries. Next point is that we can talk about taking that same solution and going across industries. Now, most organizations can have similar challenges, whether they be related to HR or human resources, other operational issues, manufacturing or marketing issues. And so those are common aspects of business across all organizations, regardless of industry. And so we've got a capability that solves a problem for a functional area like marketing, like human resources. Let's be able to make sure that we can go out and talk to that. The key, though, when we talk about those, we talk about the problems that we solve for one organization, for an organization, and how we can solve similar problems in their organization. So again, it could go across industry. Next is about previous customers. Now, these could be individuals that possibly have changed organizations. And this is, I know in our business, this is one of our most beloved things that we can. We love to have individuals. We hate to see them leave organizations, yet on the other hand, we love to see them leave organizations because that means a potential entree into a new organization that may not be doing business with us. And the point I want to make sure that we mention here is we just think about maintaining contact. If you should be especially through LinkedIn, which is the de facto community, social networking platform that we use in the business world. Let's make sure that we're first degree connections with key individuals at our customer organizations. Those individuals, when they get promoted in their organization, let's reach out, congratulate them. Should they leave their organization and they go to a new one, what I like to do and what I see as a best practice is I like to send them a congratulatory note. Congrats on their new opportunity. Wish them the best of luck. And then I put a tickler in our CRM system that I think at the appropriate time to reach back to them is probably about 90 days. And I recommend that because I think that if we're trying to reach out to them, other than just saying congrats, but trying to reach out to them and contact them for a potential business opportunity, let's say 2 weeks after they've taken that new role, I think that's just too soon. As you know, we all know that when taking a new job, the first few weeks, if not first couple of months, are really just spent getting our arms around our new job, the new organization, its culture, the new processes, the products, what have you. So I think we have to give somebody 90 days in order to get that settled in, for which we can then reach out, see how they're settling into that role, and potentially get a time frame for when they might want to engage with us. Now, once again, I'm presuming they've had a positive experience in their prior organization with you, but clearly, let's keep in touch with them, let's leverage those contacts, and let's touch them at the appropriate intervals. And lastly, the other high potential opportunity, I think, is just referrals. Now, you might be thinking, yes, of course, referrals, but it's different from, thinking about, reaching out to a customer and saying, hey, is there anybody that you can refer me to? What I want us to think about and to take action on is to help we're asking for a referral to help our prospect, help our customer think about other prospective ones in a more concrete context. So instead of just broad, is there anybody else? Think about, you might want to ask to see if they belong to any particular trade associations or organizations or other groups, by the way, which could be both business and social, potentially club memberships of some sort, and help them visualize the faces of those individuals in that trade organization, for example. And therefore, as we ask about referrals, we want them to visually think about the faces of those people in there, and that they may be able to get a better mental handle about who might be someone to recommend. Because if we leave it too broad as to anyone out there, oftentimes I find that it's just sort of a blank, well, I can't think of anyone right now, but if I do, I'll let you know. Rather, I'd like to see if I can help them, find those mental connections for organizations that they may get better contacts in, for which they can reference us into, or refer us into. I'll share one other piece about the power of the referrals, is that there was a study that was done a number of years ago by the University of North Carolina. And they did a very broad survey of asking senior executives about what's the most effective way to make contact with you. Well, the number one answer was getting an internal champion within an organization to sponsor you into a meeting with them. That was number one. The number two answer, though, it was behind number one by several percentage points, but it's still a very, very high percentage of executives who were willing to take the meeting, was based on a referral. So if a colleague says to help you in terms of referral and allow you to leverage their name, which is a very important part of that, and saying that they recommend that you contact the other organization, there's a very good chance that other individual is willing to accept that call or accept that meeting and begin an opportunity for you. So, leveraging those prior successes. Let's move down to the next part of our pipeline, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes and talk about the aspects about moving them through the sales process. And I'll just take a moment there and just point out that moving them through the sales process is how we view it, but I want to make sure that we think about it from their perspective and how we want to move our prospects through their process, which is that of the buying process. And so let me move and talk a little bit about the key elements I think that are going to take place here, and for we see our best practices and individuals and organizations that really become consultative sellers focus around getting to know their organization, their prospective organizations. They're understanding their business, understanding their industry, understanding the objectives that they have and the key challenges they're trying to solve. And when we develop that collaborative consultative selling approach, it's very subtle, but it turns where the tables get turned, if you will. We wind up creating that collaborative approach where we're working together, and it's the customer or prospective customer feeling like they're pulling us, and they're pulling us and engaging us. And it's much more them buying, if you will, rather than us just are selling or pushing a product or services on them. And it manifests itself in this way. Organizations go through a process, the buying process, if you will, as we elaborate in our value selling approach, and it works as follows. It starts with organizations having key challenges, what we refer to as business issues that need to be addressed or resolved in order to achieve their business objectives. Those business issues tend to revolve around big organizational issues that span the different parts of the industry. It starts with the organization, excuse me. It could be about bringing new products to market, reducing time to market, if you will, or about reducing costs or improving cost management. It's about revenue generation and those big challenges that most organizations are trying to address, followed by a number of day-to-day tactical problems that impede or interfere with their ability to resolve or achieve those business issues, followed by a number of different ways they can go about resolving that, which they can be various solutions to address it, followed by a value aspect to it, which represents what the investment or cost that they need to make in order to resolve those changes, implement that whatever solution it might be, as well as what the payback that they hope to achieve from being able to do so. And we must also include what all the key stakeholders are going to be involved in assessing the different issues and options to resolve it, as well as what steps they would go through in order to evaluate, decide, and implement whatever solution they select upon. That's how organizations actually make those decisions. They have challenges they're trying to address, different options they can use to address it, the impacts the various options are going to drive, determining whether or not it's worth it, the individuals that will be involved, and steps that will go through. And what we see and what we recommend is that you think about and want to align your sales process to this buying process, to how organizations buy and how the challenges they're going to seek to address. And I use this expression often in the workshops that I run, is that a trap that many sales professionals run into is that, and this is just part of human nature, is that we get excited about the things that we have to offer. And we begin by talking product all too soon, or talking the solution all too soon. And I use the expression of, let's try to keep the solution in our pocket. Let's actively try to not talk about us. Let's be the consultative seller and hold that solution in our pocket until we understand what challenges that they're facing, what is it they're looking for in the way the solution addresses it, and what would be the impact of being able to resolve those if we were able to do so. There's certainly a time and a place to talk about us and the wonderful things that we can do to help them resolve it. But let's make sure that the discovery is aligning to that buying process, understanding them before we talk about us. Now, I'm going to look at the latter part of the process here, how we close those opportunities. And closing the opportunities is really a function of how well we've been able to qualify it and determine if there's been gaps in our particular knowledge. Now, we have an expression that closing is really a natural outcome of a well-orchestrated sales cycle. And if our prospect sees how we can solve their issues and deliver them value, they're going to want to, in fact, do business with us. But just because we've taken the prospect through our various sales stages, our gates, if you will, even if we've checked all the boxes, we really have to gauge it and ask, how well qualified is it? Because it's not just checking the boxes. It's really understanding if it's the right match. And I'll take it the next step here and saying, I'm going to give you, again, a very sobering statistic. This was a study that was done by an organization called CSO Insights. And it was done a few years ago, but I haven't seen anything with more clarity or more further insight since the study. And it shows very, very, as I say, very soberingly, if that is such a word, that unfortunately less than half of the deals close, the forecasted deals actually close. Now, that doesn't say that they didn't close eventually. It didn't close within the time frame for what was initially forecasted. And so what it's really saying is that, and by the way, we are really dependent upon opportunities to close when they're forecasted. We all generate those forecasts. We commit to those. Our boss commits to those, and it goes up on the line. When we miss, they miss, and certainly the repercussions can fall out from it. So we want to do the best that we can to ensure that we've got the greatest probability of closure by understanding what those key factors are. And I'll take a moment just to highlight what we've looked at literally hundreds of deals, and we find out that there are 5 main reasons why deals stall and the pitfalls, therefore, that we can encounter when doing our forecasting. Number 1 is the lack of connection to a critical business issue, meaning that the solution that was being presented didn't connect to a major challenge or a major business issue that the individual in the organization were looking to address. It may have been addressing something on a lower level or more, if you will, more of a tactical basis and wasn't connected to that critical business issue. Number 2 was there was a lack of differentiation. That when there's when similar, again, and today, offerings sound increasingly similar in their nature and their capabilities. And so when that happens, the prospect is left to have to further spend more time to try to understand, again, why A versus B, and that only creates the potential for stalling that decision. Number 3 was decision authority, interacting with individuals that did not have the authority to make a purchase. Number 4 is about this lack of perceived value, and this is, this was the ability or lack of the process to understand for the prospect to understand what the impact that the solution would drive for them. And lastly there was too much risk of making a change to migrate or change to the new solution that was being presented was just too great of a risk to the organization. And once again, it caused a stall, which impacted the forecasting probabilities. So in value selling, we have a very straightforward approach that we call a qualified prospect formula that can use to identify where the gaps might be. And it follows as such. What I can say is a well-qualified prospect has 4 main components. Number 1, that we achieve what we call a vision match that's differentiated. And that's simply put that the prospect has issues for which we have capabilities to address, and in some way that we are unique or differentiated so that they would make a purchase decision from us. So it answers that question, should they buy from us? The second element is value. And value is not a budget or that's been allocated, because budget is something that when there's sufficient value, even budget monies that haven't been allocated can be done so. So the question becomes, is there sufficient value to warrant or answer that question, is it worth it? The third element being what we call power. Are we interacting with the individual who has the authority to make a purchase decision? Have we created a vision match and a value match at the power level, the decision-making level? And the fourth element is plan. Do we have a clear set of steps that, when successfully completed to our prospects' acceptance, will they buy? So what are the steps that we're going through in the specific timelines? Is it been mutually established? Is it ideally in writing? Because something in writing is much more concrete than just a verbal conversation. We'll answer that last question about when they buy. So those 4 components work together to help us determine how well qualified that opportunity is. And it works. It looks very straightforward, and it is, but it really is from the feedback we've gotten from over the many, many years we've been sharing this and working with our customers, it works because it focuses on the most important elements. It's that answers those 4 questions that I just took you through. Is there a match? Is there sufficient value? Do we have the right authority or power? And what's the right steps that we'll go through with the plan? Those are much more important in answering those than just checking the boxes that we've moved them through our process. And also, we find that trying to exhaust every little detail, again, can take us away from the big picture of what the key factors are that are at play in answering those 4 questions. And the last point I'll mention here is what I call a sin of certainty. That, especially if we hear this from time to time, that individuals say that, we think this opportunity is going to close. We had a really great meeting with them. There seems to be a really strong connection. Those are great, and I won't take away from it, but it's also very subjective. When we look at those points that I just mentioned there on that qualified prospect formula, we really are breaking it down, as I said, to those fundamental aspects that if we achieve those, we're more likely to have a much more highly qualified prospect. So exceptional qualification really going to break down to this. We're going to be qualifying the opportunities throughout that sales process. My graphic that I had of the pipeline a couple slides ago showed at the lower part, and ideally I really should have brought that up throughout the funnel aspect that we were going through. And then we want to be repeatedly measuring or qualifying our opportunities through the lens of that QP formula. And what it'll say is that when I work with clients to talk about it, the QP formula can reveal gaps in our understanding. Now, initially you may think, oh, gaps, that's not good, but gaps are okay, especially if we identify them early, because it tells us that some aspect that's unresolved. And it gives us, especially if we catch it early in the process, gives us a chance to get in and to ideally close that gap and be able to address those issues and therefore increase that probability. The other thing I just mentioned is that it takes honesty. Sometimes it's just human nature. We feel that the pipeline reviews that we might have with our manager, can sound like the Spanish Inquisition, and we're really being tested. But if we honestly ask ourselves the questions that we have there, we'll get a sense for do we have it covered, or might there be a gap? So I encourage you to be very honest, brutally honest, is the expression I often use with both ourselves and with our management. Because if we establish that level of honesty, with our manager, then we can be able to have a collaborative discussion about, well, if there is a gap, what steps can we take to try to close it, address it, and again, improve the quality of the opportunity. And lastly, I'll mention is that the answers that I want you to think about would be the answers that if someone, a third party, an outside consultant, let's say, were to ask your customer the question, what's the answer that they would give? So it's what they say versus what we want to hear or want to believe. So let's move on. So if we kind of wrap up the aspects there, I'll just mention that what's really that qualification is not something that we do only at the end of the process or only do with our monthly forecasting sessions, but ideally it's something that we're continually looking at the opportunities through that lens and asking ourselves, as I mentioned a moment ago, are there potential gaps in our opportunity and our knowledge that we can try to go in and try to close? So with that, I'm going to pause and just open the floor up here to see if there's any particular questions. And I'll take a sip of water and I'll see if anything comes in. Okay, I have one question that I see. It's what's your view on the role of social selling in prospecting? Okay, in our vortexing prospecting model, social selling is clearly a key element. You're seeing more and more social selling being done today. Again, especially of the Gen X folks, or the millennial folks, really using social media as a way of connecting and communicating with their customers and prospective customers. And with that, though, is that I think that that's one of the 3 legs of the tripod. very important role that it does play, and it plays a key part in our selling activities. But it's not just that. Certainly, email is here to stay, and I'm going to suggest that the telephone is still here to stay as well. It's still individuals wanting to interact voice to voice, face to face, as part of our selling efforts. Okay. See if there are any other questions. And another one I see here that what's the best way to determine value? Well, let me see if I can answer it this way. That value is something that's we use the expression value is customer specific. It's something that we need to uncover as part of our selling activities, and it's something that I want to use in our discoveries of asking. So ideally, I like to understand where have we, as I mentioned before on the success stories, understanding where we have delivered value to other customers and the impact our solutions are being able to drive and whatever the key metrics might be. Reducing time to market, increasing productivity, reducing inventory costs, reducing carry costs. However we found our solutions driving value for other customers is the one thing I want to be thinking about. But I want to be careful about not presuming that there's value. I want to get their perspective on what the impact potentially could be and what value prop they may want to receive from our capabilities. So understanding value comes from that. Okay. Let me see if there's any other questions. I don't see any others at the moment. So let me move forward. I mentioned at the beginning of the session that today's webinar is being recorded. It'll be available in approximately 48 hours for your availability. Be able to download the slides and or the audio. And that let's look ahead. My esteemed colleague, I just saw him yesterday, David Bick, will be doing the next webinar, and he'll be doing that on May 17th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. David is a great, knowledgeable individual, and I'm sure you will enjoy his session. And so I'm going to ask by wrapping up by saying, I hope that you found that today's webinar to be of value to you. Follow us, Value Selling Associates, on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Twitter. And with that, I say thank you for your listening attention this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you may be. I hope that it was of value. I hope that you'll have a great day, great quarter, great year, good selling, and good luck.